Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Major Joseph Bowman of the Illinois Regiment, Virginia State Forces, and I am your most humble and obedient servant. In Illinois' role in the Revolution, is that correct?
Yes.
As I was one of the direct participants in those glorious events in our revolution against the British, it will be my pleasure to share my recollections of those days with you. Now, before we begin, let's talk about what I mean when I say the Northwest Territory. In your time today, you call it the old Northwest Territory because for you, the Northwest Territory is the Pacific Northwest. But in my time, this is the Northwest. And what I'm talking about is all of modern-day Illinois, all of modern-day Indiana, all of modern-day Ohio, all of modern-day Michigan, including the Upper Peninsula here, all of modern-day Wisconsin, and this portion of northeastern Minnesota. That's the Northwest Territory. So keep the vastness of that region in mind as we talk about this story. Now, 3 weeks from yesterday, we're going to be celebrating the 250th birthday of our country on the 4th of July. And the only reason that you're going to be celebrating that is because of this campaign. It's the only reason why Illinois and all the rest of those states that I mentioned came to be part of America today. And this is the story of how it happened. Now, to understand the conquest of the Northwest, we first have to go back to the end of the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War ends in 1763. Of course, France loses. And as part of the treaty that ended the war, they had to abandon all of their North American holdings. So their government had to leave North America forever, but the settlers were allowed to remain as long as they renounced their allegiance to the King of France and signed an oath of allegiance to the King of Great Britain. So the area that we're talking about here was French. It had been discovered by the French, it had been explored by the French, and it had been settled by the French. So all these river towns down here, Cahokia, Kaskaskia, Vincennes, Detroit, all the towns around the Great Lakes here, they're all French. They're culturally French, they're ethnically French, but they're under British authority. So there was no English white settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains prior to the end of the French and Indian War. Now there might be some temporary white English explorers or surveyors or hunting parties over the mountain men that went there, but nobody lived there permanently. So prior to the end of the French and Indian War, if you're white and you're living in a settlement west of the Appalachian, you're French. At the end of the French and Indian War, that changes. Americans start flooding into an area that was originally called Kentucky. And we called it that because that's what the Indians called it. It was spelled C-A-N-T-U-C-K-E-E, Kentucky. And it was a very rich bottomland on the southern shore of the Ohio River. It was a cane land, it was abundant in game, and no Indian tribes lived there. The tribes in the region used it as a common hunting ground, but nobody lived there. In fact, they had a pact amongst themselves that if any warring tribes encountered each other in Kentucky, they wouldn't war against each other there. It was no man's land. So we're attracted to Kentucky for the exact same reason that they are, except we're settling there. So as we start settling there, it starts putting pressure on the tribes that use it as a hunting ground. They don't want us there, so they contact the British government through their Indian agents and complain about the ever-increasing number of Americans who are starting to settle in Kentucky. And they threaten another Indian war on the frontier if it doesn't stop. So the king's ministers draw an arbitrary line across the crest of the Appalachian Mountains that they call the Proclamation Line of 1763. And what it does is it forbids any American settlement west of that line. And it was just to pacify the Indians. So the British had won the French and Indian War, but in doing so, it had nearly bankrupted them. In fact, all the taxes that they started imposing on the American colonies beginning in 1765, so the Townshend Acts, the Navigation Act, the Stamp Act, the Intolerable Act, all of those things that 10 years later would result in the American Revolution, the purpose of them was to pay off their war debt from the French and Indian War. So the last thing that the British government wanted to do was provoke another war on the frontier when they hadn't even finished paying for the last one yet. So that's why they drew the proclamation line and forbid settlement there. Now, Western settlement was critical to us who lived in the West. We were very poor people, and we lived a very subsistence lifestyle. Most of us are illiterate, we're uneducated, most of us are unskilled. Almost everyone is a subsistence farmer. And the key to our future development, in your time you call it climbing the socio-economic ladder. The key to that is the availability of free open land in the West. So when the king draws that arbitrary line and says you can't cross that and settle there, we knew they couldn't enforce it. So we did what is the birthright of all Americans. We simply ignored a stupid, unenforceable law. They had no better chance of preventing us from settling Kentucky than they have of keeping you driving the speed limit on the interstate. So we knew they couldn't do anything about it, so we continued to settle in Kentucky in ever-increasing numbers. And by 1774, there are so many Virginians living in Kentucky now that we petitioned to be adopted as an official county of Virginia. So we sent 2 delegates, and there weren't just Virginians living in Kentucky, by the way. There were Pennsylvanians there were Marylanders, North Carolinians, but the vast majority are Virginians. So we sent 2 delegates from the Kentucky settlements to Williamsburg, which is the capital of Virginia at the time, to petition on our behalf to be adopted as an official county of Virginia. And one of those 2 delegates was none other than our future regimental commander, George Rogers Clark himself. And they're successful. So Kentucky is now adopted as an official county of Virginia. They used to call this entire region here Fincastle County. And then in 1774, when Kentucky is adopted, the name is now anglicized. So instead of the Indian name of Kentucky, now it's Kentucky. So Kentucky is adopted as a county of Virginia. They have full representation in the House of Burgesses. And the remainder of the area now becomes known as Illinois County. So Illinois, in my time, is a county of Virginia. So where we sit and talk right here today is Virginia. So welcome to Virginia, everyone. Now, the British knew we were doing this. They also knew there was nothing they could do to stop it. So they turned a blind eye to it and pretended as if it weren't happening. Until the next year, when the war breaks out on April 19, 1775, now the British think that they have a problem on their hand. They have a large and rapidly growing population that they think is hostile in their western frontier in Kentucky that's there illegally, and they want them gone. As it turns out, it wasn't really a hostile population. There's a myth in your time that almost all Americans supported independency. And that's not true. That myth was created because after the war, the loyalists had to leave. You can't fight against the freedom of your fellow countrymen and expect to be able to live in peace with them. So after they lost, they had to leave. So some of them went to England, most of them went up to Canada, very few of them stayed here. So that created the illusion that the majority of Americans wanted independence. As it really happened, there was only about 40% of us that ever wanted independency. 20% wanted to remain loyal to the king, and the other 40% didn't care either way what happened. Now, a large percentage of those 40% that didn't care either way were living on the frontier. They just wanted to be left alone. And if the king had left good enough alone, he would have found that they probably weren't hostile. But he couldn't leave good enough alone. He wanted to drive them out of Kentucky. Now, the revolution has started, and the king needs all of his regular troops in the eastern seaboard fighting the fledgling Continental Army and all the various state regiments and militias that were arrayed against him. In fact, he didn't even have enough regular troops for that, so he had to hire the German Hessian mercenaries to come over and augment the crown forces in the east. He certainly didn't have enough regular troops to fight a war in the west, so he reached into the same bag of tricks and he hired another group of mercenaries to fight his proxy war on the frontier against us in Kentucky. And who do you think those mercenaries were?
Indians.
The Indians, exactly. They didn't want us there anyways. So the way that this system worked is the Indians in the region would raid the Kentucky settlements, and they would kill anybody that they could get their hands on, and as proof that they had done it, they'd take their scalp. And they would take those scalps back to the outposts that were controlled by the British. So we're talking about Cahokia here on the Mississippi River, Kaskaskia on the Kaskaskia River, Vincennes on the Wabash River, and then Fort Detroit itself. And these towns, by the way, were still completely culturally French. Remember, those French people were allowed to stay there as long as they renounced their allegiance to France and signed an oath of allegiance to Great Britain. So they were allowed to stay in their homes. So technically they're British subjects, but their real allegiance is to France. They're French at heart still. So what the king's ministers did is, there's no British regulars in any of these towns except Detroit. There's the King's 8th Regiment of Foot up in Detroit with Henry Hamilton. He's the British governor, technically a lieutenant governor that administers that entire Northwest Territory that I talked about earlier. But for the rest of the towns, they just appoint a local French official to be the administrator on behalf of the crown of those towns. So the Indians take these bloody scalps to these outposts, Cahokia, Kaskaskia, Vincennes, and Detroit, and they exchange them for trade goods. And the things they're exchanging them for is whatever the Indians fancied in their villages that made their lives easier. So trade muskets, gunpowder, gun flints, lead, blankets, cooking pots, woven textiles, beads, trinkets, alcohol. Whatever they wanted is what your life as a Kentucky settler was reduced to, the value of your scalp and trade goods. And because those scalps were a bloodshed, they weren't just targeting military-age men like me. They're killing anybody that they can get their hands on, because a scalp is a scalp is a scalp. And there's no difference between my scalp and your scalp and your scalp and a little child's scalp. So they are killing everybody without regard to age or sex or condition. Every once in a while, they might take you prisoner, but usually if they do, you'd rather that they just killed you on the spot, because they're taking you back to their village in order to torture you to death for their own entertainment. In rare circumstances, if you're young, they might take you back to adopt into their tribe to replace one of their fallen warriors. If they recognize you as an important person, they might take you prisoner to use in a prisoner exchange later. For instance, when they captured Daniel Boone after the Battle of Blue Licks, they took him back into their tribe as a prisoner because they all knew Boone, but Boone escaped before they were able to exchange him. But for the most part, you could count on being killed if you were captured by the Indians in Kentucky. And it got so bad that by the end of 1777, we called that the year of the Bloody Sevens. Kentucky was almost completely wiped out. It was reduced to just 3 remaining settlements on the Kentucky River. There was Boonesboro, so that's the one that was founded by Daniel Boone. You've all heard of him, I'm sure. There was Harrodstown, and then there was Logan Station or Logan's Fort. It goes by either name. And that was it. The rest of Kentucky had been wiped out, and the people had either been killed, forced to flee back east for safety, or were fording up in one of those 3 remaining outposts, and those 3 outposts were under constant siege. So Kentucky is hanging on by the skin of its teeth. And this is where George Rogers Clark re-enters the picture. Now, Clark is a Virginian. He's a member of the Virginia gentry, but he's a surveyor by trade, and he's been living in Kentucky. So he has a vested interest in making sure that the West stays open for future exploration and settlement. And he has a plan to alleviate the pressure on Kentucky. He correctly diagnoses that the Indians are mercenaries. They're fighting because they're being paid to fight. And he also knows from his very limited militia experience in Lord Dunmore's war back in '74 that you're not going to sneak up in the Indians in their home country and successfully fight them. If you have a force that's small enough to sneak up on them, first of all, you ain't going to, and when they realize that you're coming and that you're small enough, they're just going to ambush you and wipe you out. If you have a force that's large enough where they don't want to face you in battle, they know you're coming from even further out, and they'll evacuate their village. So when you get there, there's nobody to fight, there's no crops to burn, there's no village to destroy. So trying to fight the Indians in their own country is never going to work, and Clark knew this. Rather, he thought the way to alleviate the suffering in Kentucky was to take control of the outposts from which the British are paying the Indians to raid Kentucky. Remember, he diagnosed that they're mercenaries. They're fighting because they're being paid to fight, and if you interrupt that system of payment, they're going to stop fighting. So he devises a plan. Before he does that, he plants 2 spies a whole year before he proposes this plan to the Virginia government. He places 2 spies in the Illinois country so that he could start getting intelligence on what the lay of the land was like there in preparation for his campaign. At the end of 1777, he travels to Williamsburg, Virginia, which is the capital of Virginia at the time, and he meets with Governor Patrick Henry. This is the first elected governor of Virginia after the last royal governor had been forced to flee for fear of his life and the safety of his family. So this is give me liberty or give me death, Patrick Henry. This is the same man. He's the governor of Virginia now, and Clark meets with him and proposes this campaign. Now Henry knows that in order for this crazy campaign to succeed, it has to be done with utmost secrecy. And there's simply too many mouths in the House of Burgesses, the Virginia legislature, for it to remain a secret. So he never informs the House of Burgesses. Rather, he calls 5 of his most trusted counselors together to review the plan and give their opinion on it. So some night in Williamsburg, Virginia, I don't know if this happened in the governor's palace or I don't know if this happened in a council room in the Capitol. I suspect the governor's palace for more secrecy. These 5 luminaries of the Revolution get together and decide the fate of the entire Northwest Territory. It's Patrick Henry, George Rogers Clark, Thomas Jefferson, George Wythe, and George Mason. Those are the 5. So they approved the plan, and what they approved was the raising of 7 companies of 50 men each. And they were to be called the Illinois Regiment because the object of our campaign was going to be in Illinois County here. Now that's a regiment in name only. In my time, 2 battalions comprise a regiment, and a battalion is more than 350 men. So when we call ourselves the Illinois Regiment, we are a regiment in no way, shape, or form, and that's if we reached our maximum authorized strength, which we never did. The most we ever raised was 150 men. So we were 200 men underpowered from the start. Now, upon authorization of the plan, Clark appoints 4 company commanders. And those company commanders are to go to their respective home counties in Virginia and recruit their companies. And I, Joseph Bowman, was one of those original company commanders. So I went back to Frederick County, Virginia, because that's where I'm from, and I recruited my company in Frederick County. The plan was in the spring, so this is now 1778. In the spring of 78, we were all to meet at the Redstone Settlements on the Monongahela River here, just south of Fort Pitt. And that's where we were going to begin our campaign. It wasn't because we recruited our companies separate from one another. We had no idea how many men we had. It wasn't until we all met up at Redstone that we realized that we only had 150 men. But there was no prospect of getting any more, and we needed to begin the campaign. And recruiting was very, very tough at the time because we were all pulling from the same pool of men. So we're recruiting from the exact same group that the Continental Army is trying to recruit from, that the various state regiments are trying to recruit from, and that the militia is drawing from. And keep in mind also that when recruiting a frontier army, a lot of those people on the frontier were in that 40% that really didn't care which way the American Revolution went. On the other hand, there was also bloodlust on the frontier for the Indians because of what they had done to Kentucky through 1777. So we used that as a recruiting opportunity. So Patrick Henry issued 2 sets of orders when he authorized the regiment. He issued the private orders, which was the real nature of our mission, and then he issued the public orders, which were the orders that we recruited our companies from. And the public orders were deceitful. The public orders said that we're going into Indian country and we're going to take vengeance against the Indians for what they did to Kentucky. And it was easy to get volunteers for that because, like I said, there was just bloodlust on the frontier for the Indians. The other thing we did is we offered a 300-acre land grant to any man who completed his term of service. And that was very valuable on the frontier because land was easy to claim on the frontier. It was hard to keep because once you claimed it, you marked it, you cleared it, you settled it, and it was yours until the surveyors came and stole it out from underneath you later. These 300 acres, these came to you with full title and deed from the government of Virginia, so they weren't going to steal that. So that 300-acre land grant was a large inducement as well as the prospect of taking vengeance against the Indians. So that was what we recruited our companies on the basis of. Now, I'd mentioned before that when the Kentucky settlers were forced to flee back east, this Fort Pitt Redstone settlement area was a large gathering point for them, and they wanted to go back to their homes. They wanted to resettle Kentucky And in addition to them, there were new settlers that wanted to go to Kentucky too. But it wasn't safe for any of them to go without a military escort. So we were their military escort. So when we were ready to begin our campaign, we had collected a series of riverboats and canoes, and we made our way with these civilian settlers in tow from Fort Pitt all the way down the Ohio River here to the Falls of the Ohio. And the Falls of the Ohio doesn't exist anymore in your time. It was a long, very shallow rapids more than a waterfall. And there was also a series of islands there. There was a very large one right at the falls named Corn Island. And we decided that we were going to make a temporary camp at Corn Island. The reason that we gave at the time was another lie. We said we were deep in Indian country with no means of support or reinforcement around us. And if we were discovered and attacked, Corn Island, being in the river, would be more defensible. None of that was true. The reason was because it was at Corn Island that we were going to reveal the private orders from Governor Henry, which was the true nature of our campaign, and we knew the men weren't going to be happy with it. Now, at Corn Island, at the falls, we were also met by the Kentucky militia. What few men they were able to spare came overland and met us there, and they were there for the unveiling of the private orders. So when Colonel Clark revealed the true nature of our campaign, it goes without saying that the men weren't very happy, because this literally wasn't what they signed up for. In the evening, a lieutenant of the Kentucky militia, and I won't even mention his name because he's a coward and just a pariah, and he should be not remembered by history. But he conspired with several of the men from the Kentucky militia to desert that night. They found a place that was unguarded around the perimeter of the island, and where you could wade across to the river. Corn Island was very close to the southern bank of the Ohio River there. They waded across and deserted and escaped into the night. And when we found out about it the next morning, Colonel Clark sent a party out to try and ride them down and bring them back. But we were only successful in being able to capture just a handful of them and bring them back. Now, the rest of the men didn't have a choice. They weren't happy either, but home was going all the way up the Ohio River against the current, and we controlled all the boats. That wasn't the case with the Kentucky militia. They came overland, they weren't far from home, and they knew how to get back there, and so they did. Now, as it turned out, those Kentucky militia that made it back to their settlements were treated as cowards and deserters for the rest of their day. They should have stayed with us, because as it turned out, had they stayed with us, not a single one of them would have died. We didn't lose a single man in this entire campaign. But at any rate, desertion is like a virus. It's catching, and it spreads very fast. And Clark knew that once the men, who were already unhappy now, realized that desertion was a possibility, it was going to keep happening. So Clark decided we need to commence the rest of the campaign now. So he called a council of us officers together, and we decided we were going to tell the men, well, we decided to send the Kentucky militia home, because we talked about it last night, and we decided we got more than enough men, which was a lie. We were severely under strength. But we got more than enough men, and they're more needed defending their settlements, so we sent them back home, and we're just going to finish the rest of the campaign with what we have here. So we prepared to get back in the river and leave Corn Island, and Clark left instructions for the civilians. They went no further than Corn Island with us. From this point on, it's just the Illinois Regiment. He left instructions for the settlers to move the settlement from Corn Island to the southern shore of the Ohio River upon our departure, because again, we weren't on Corn Island for defensive purposes. It was purely to prevent desertion. So once they moved to the southern shore, they were to found a permanent settlement, and they did that, and that settlement is Louisville, Kentucky. So if you're ever down there, you'll see that they regard George Rogers Clark as the father of Louisville, and that's why. And Louisville is named after King Louis XVI of France, because prior to our departure, we became aware of the Treaty of Alliance that had been signed between King Louis XVI and the Continental Congress. So Louisville got its name because it's named in honor of King Louis and the Treaty of Alliance. And that Treaty of Alliance, by the way, is going to play prominently a little bit further in the story. So we get back in the water, and we make our way down the Ohio until we get close to Fort Massac. So we're 3 leagues upstream from Fort Massac at the mouth of the Tennessee River. And there we encounter a party of long hunters. Now that's a problem because this is the first time that we've been seen. And we don't know who these people are. On the frontier, everybody looks the same. So we don't know if these people are British. We don't know if they're American. We don't know if they're French. And if they're American, we don't know if they're patriot or loyalist. So we pull them ashore and we detain them and we start interrogating them. And to our great good fortune, it turns out that not only are they American, but they're patriots, and they're supporting our cause, and they're willing to serve as guides for the remainder of the trip. And guess where they just came from? Kaskaskia. Now we're no longer, I remember those 2 spies that Clark planted in Illinois a year before the campaign? We're no longer operating on intelligence that's a year old now. Now we're operating on intelligence that's a week old. Now, we also knew on the basis of that intelligence, by the way, I mentioned that the British government had installed local French townspeople as the authorities in the town. Well, the one who was in charge of Kaskaskia was a man by the name of Mr. Rocheblave. And he was expecting an attack. But he thought it could only come down the Ohio to the Mississippi, up the Mississippi to the Kaskaskia, and then up the Kaskaskia to the town of Kaskaskia. We knew that he had lookouts all the way down the Mississippi from Kaskaskia to the mouth of the Ohio looking for an attack. There was an old abandoned French military road that went from Fort Massac to Kaskaskia, and we knew that it was there, and we also knew that no one was watching it because Fort Massac was the last French fort that was ever built in North America. And they finished it just in time to lose the French and Indian War. So when it was built, it had strategic value because everything that was east and upstream was enemy British territory, and everything that was west and downstream was friendly French territory. After the French and Indian War and the French have to leave North America, the fort no longer has any strategic value because now everything, either direction, upstream or downstream, is friendly British territory, so the British never choose to garrison it. So they take over a brand new fort and immediately let it fall into ruin. And that road that connected Fort Kaskaskia was accordingly left to fall into ruin. It was very maintenance intensive to build and maintain a road through the wilderness back then. And just like in your time today, you can't build a road and walk away from it and never maintain it and expect it to last very long. You have to do continual maintenance on it. Well, the same was true with roads in my time. And this road had now been abandoned for 15 years because after the fort was abandoned, it's literally the road to nowhere. So it was never maintained, and in 15 years, it was very overgrown and not even considered a road anymore, which is why no one was guarding it, and we knew that. So we put ashore at a creek right at Fort Massac here. We spent the night of the 27th of June. This is 1778 at the ruins of Fort Massac, and then the next morning on the 28th, we started out on this abandoned French military road for Kaskaskia. We arrive on the outskirts of Kaskaskia on the evening of none other than July the 4th, 1778, and we cross the Kaskaskia River north of the town and surround it. Now, if you guys are familiar with that area, you might think that sounds strange because you say Kaskaskia is on the east bank of the Mississippi River now. Why are you crossing the Kaskaskia River to get to it? In my time, Kaskaskia was west of the Kaskaskia River and east of the Mississippi River. What happened is a later flood, in fact it was in 1881, caused the Mississippi River to jump its channel, flow into the Kaskaskia, and it never reverted back to its original course. So now the confluence of the Mississippi and the Kaskaskia is 10 miles further north than it was in my time. So now Kaskaskia is one of those rare parts of Illinois that's on the west side of the Mississippi River. So if you want to get to it, you can't get to it from Illinois. You have to cross into Missouri and come at it from the backside. But in my time, it's on the west side of the Kaskaskia River, the east side of the Mississippi River. So we crossed the Kaskaskia River, landed north of the town, surrounded it in the middle of the night. It's now past midnight, so this is July the 5th. And we take control of the town, and we did it with such complete surprise and secrecy that we didn't have to fire a shot. Nobody knew we were there. We took over the town. We kicked open the door of Mr. Rocheblave at his house. We found him in bed with his wife, and we announced that we were Virginians and we were in control now, and he no longer was. And Mr. Rocheblave just hated us passionately until his dying day, probably because of the rude awakening we gave him. The rest of the French warmed up to us over time, but Rocheblave always hated us. But at any rate, we're now in control of Kaskaskia. And remember, these people are culturally French, but they're technically British, and they've signed an oath of allegiance to Great Britain, and we have no idea what kind of resistance we can meet from them. So we put out an order that everyone is to remain in their house, and anyone that we find on the street is going to be shot on the spot. And we need to maintain that tight control until we can get a sense of what kind of resistance we're going to meet. And that worked to our advantage, and our appearance also worked to our advantage, because the French had been told by the British that we were savages from the frontier. We were known as the Big Knives, or some people called us the Long Knives. Generally it was the Big Knives. And if the Big Knives captured you, these local French people, they call themselves habitants, by the way, these local French habitants, if they were to be captured by us, they could expect savage treatment. They thought the men were all going to be put to death, the women were going to be raped. I think they thought we were going to eat their children, and they were terrified of us. And when we got there, we looked the part. As Colonel Clark later wrote in his memoir, we were nearly naked by the time we got there, and we bore a very savage appearance. So we let that play to our advantage. So we kept these French people locked in their houses for a few days. And then finally, they had petitioned a local traveling priest. His name is Father Pierre Gibault. And remember, too, not only are these people culturally French, they're religiously French, so they're all papists. And they're not allowed to practice their religion freely and openly when they're under British rule, because the British are Anglican and they're very anti-papist, so their religion has been repressed. But their traveling priest still manages to sneak into the area. And the French town's officials propositioned him, Father Gibault, to approach Colonel Clark and petition that before we do our worst to them, if they could be allowed to have one more mass together in their church and say their goodbyes to one another. And it was at this time that Colonel Clark realizes that it's time to release the grip on these people. Colonel Clark, and by the way, when I tell you these stories of him, this man's only 25 years old. And he has no professional military experience. His only experience at all was for the blink of an eye as a militia officer in Lord Dunmore's war back in 1774. He is what you would call in your time a master of psychology. That term doesn't exist in my time, but that's what you would say about him today. So he now realizes that I have these people exactly where I want them, and now is the time to release the grip a little bit. So he looks at Father Gibault, and he says, well, you can do whatever you want. He says, I never told you couldn't do those things. Now, again, that was a lie. He told them exactly that. He said, if any of you leave your house, you're going to be shot on the spot. But that served our purpose at the time, and now it no longer does. So Clark looks at him and says, you can do whatever you want. He said, you're free. We're your liberators. We're not your conquerors. The British were your conquerors. We're your liberators. You can do whatever you want. Leave your house, have your mass, visit your friends and neighbors. You can do whatever you want. You're free now. And with that, the French habitants are just over the moon with us, except Rocheblave. He hated us till the end. But the rest of these French habitants are just very, very much in favor of us. And we were empowered, by the way, to make them citizens of Virginia on the spot. Now, we couldn't make them citizens of the United States because there is no United States back then. There wasn't a national identity. It was growing, but it didn't exist yet. So we had no power to make them citizens of the United States, but we could make them citizens of Virginia, and we did. And almost every single one of them took the oath of allegiance to Virginia on the spot. So now they're our allies, and they find out what the remainder of our campaign is supposed to be. They find out that we're going to be taking Cahokia next and then Vincennes, and they tell us, take us with you. They said, we know these people. You know, we're related to them. They're friends of ours. We have regular correspondence and business and trade with them. They said, take several of our townspeople with you, and we'll go before you and tell them that you're liberators, that they should lay down their arms and not resist, and you won't have to fire a shot. And that is exactly what happened. So my company, Joseph Bowman's company, was dispatched by Colonel Clark to go up to Cahokia and take control of that town. And I took several of these townspeople with me, and they were true to their word. They went in advance of us. They met with the local townspeople there in Cahokia, and they persuaded them to offer no resistance to us and rather to join our cause. And they did. So now we have Cahokia and Kaskaskia without a shot being fired or a life being lost. And we're converting them to citizens of Virginia at the time. We do the exact same thing to Vincennes. So now we have control of all three, and we haven't fired a shot yet. But now we're the victim of our own success. Remember, we only have 150 men. And now we have 3 towns that we have to garrison, and one of them is all the way across Illinois. And at Vincennes, there's a fort there called Fort Sackville, and Fort Sackville was dilapidated. It was not defensible. So because we didn't have enough men to garrison all 3, and because Fort Sackville wasn't defensible anyways, we only left a captain, Leonard Helm, and a private soldier there to oversee the local French militia. The rest of us went back to the Mississippi River towns. I returned to Cahokia, and Clark took the rest of the regiment down to Kaskaskia. So now we're in possession of those 3 towns, and we do 2 very important things at Cahokia. Number 1 is we make liaison with the Spanish across the river in St. Louis here. Now everyone knows about the alliance that we had with France. What most people in your time don't know is we also were allies with Spain at the time. Spain didn't provide anywhere near the support that France did, but they were an ally nonetheless. And when Patrick Henry had authorized the Illinois campaign, he contacted his counterpart, Governor Francisco de Leyva, who was over here in Spanish St. Louis. St. Louis was the capital of Spanish Louisiana, if I didn't say that. He contacted de Leyva, and he said, I have an expedition that's coming out your way, and if they make it there, they're going to be in bad need of resupply. If you would be so kind as to resupply them, we'll reimburse you from the Virginia Treasury. And that's exactly what happened. As I mentioned before, our clothes were threadbare by the time we got to the Mississippi River. And once we made contact with the Spanish, they showered us with everything you can think of to turn yourself into a properly clothed and equipped regiment. They gave us bolts and bolts and bolts of their blue and white wool that we used to make uniforms. They gave us stockings, shoes buckles, shirts, buttons, hats, neck stocks, Spanish muskets, bayonets, cartridge boxes, everything. And we turned ourselves, ironically enough, we were so far away from our closest American base of support here at Fort Pitt, and we're all the way out here in the Mississippi River Valley, and yet we ended up being one of the best equipped and supplied regiments in the entire American service in the Revolution, thanks to our Spanish friends. Now, we did one more important thing at Cahokia. Cahokia, as long as anyone can remember, has been a center of Indian culture. In fact, have any of you heard of the Cahokia Indian mounds down there? Well, Cahokia, from time immemorial, has been an important center of culture for the Indians. So it was at Cahokia that Clark decided he was going to call a council of all the hostile tribes in the region and try and persuade them to stop raiding Kentucky. So not only are we deep in enemy territory with no means of support or reinforcement, Clark now decides that he's going to intentionally surround ourselves with the enemy. So he calls this council of the Indians, and he was very careful to make sure that they were never able to see all of us together in the same place at the same time, so they couldn't see what our strength was. And by that, what I mean, they couldn't see how weak we really were. So Clark calls this council with the Indians, and before he did that, he had had 2 wampum belts made up, a red one and a white one. In fact, I think I still have those in my pack. Bear with me just 1 minute. Have any of you ever been to Cahokia?
Yes.
Do you know the old church there? The old wooden church? Do you know that field, the green open grass field that's right across from the church? Yes? Okay, well this is where this happened at, is in that field right across from the church. So these are the wampum belts that we use, and people in your time misunderstand what a wampum belt is. you tend to think it's used as a form of currency, and it's not. Wampum belts were just a pictorial reference. The Indians had no written language, so they told their stories in pictures. So sometimes wampum belts were plain like this, other times they had designs woven into them. It might tell the story, the history of a tribe, it might tell the story of a treaty, it might tell the story of a battle. But that's what wampum belts were used for. They were pictorial references. They were never used as money. The beads that they were made out of had value as trade goods, but the wampum belts themselves were never used as currency. So the red wampum belt signified war for obvious reasons, and the white wampum belt signified peace. So when Clark met with the Indians, he knew that there's two ways to treat with Indians, the British way and the French way. The British way is to look down on the Indians as children and having weak minds, and to treat them as infants, and to try and buy their allegiance with trade goods. The French way is just to treat them as equals, to treat them as human beings with dignity and respect. And Clark always knew that the French way was the better way. So that's how he starts off treating with the Indians. He starts explaining to them the nature of the American Revolution, and he doesn't do it in childlike terms. He tells them about the history of English settlement in North America and the way that our charters were initially set up. He talks about the growing tyranny of the British Crown, how they were revoking our charters and replacing them. He talks about the nature of the rights of man. And the Indians, just to prove the universal appeal of these themes to the human soul, this appeals to the Indians. And many of them say at the time, we never heard your side of the story before. We had only heard what the British told us about your war. We never heard your side. And now that we've heard your side, we realize that you're in the right and the British are wrong. And we're not going to make war against Kentucky anymore. Now that wasn't all of the Indians, that was some. For some that was still on the fence and didn't know whether they were going to give up raiding Kentucky or not, Clark then finishes with this. He grabs the two wampum belts and he makes sure that he's holding the red wampum belt of war in his strong, dominant right hand. And he holds them up and he says, and now you have a choice to make. He said, you can choose the red wampum belt of war, or you can choose the white wampum belt of peace. And it doesn't make any difference to me which one you choose. Now that again is a lie. It was critically important which one they chose. The whole reason for our campaign was to get them to stop raiding Kentucky. But he doesn't want to show weakness. So he says, it doesn't matter to me which one you choose. I glory in war. That's the exact words that he said to them. I glory in war. He said, my men are warriors and we're looking for warriors to fight. We no longer take any satisfaction in fighting the British because the British have become like women, and my men take no satisfaction in fighting women. Now, beg pardon, ladies, but that's what he said. He said, if your men are warriors and you're looking for warriors to fight, then you take the red wampum belt and you go back to your village, and we'll let you go in peace, as if we could have stopped them. But you go back to your village and you get ready because we're coming for you. And the next time you see us, death is coming with us. And we're going to kill your men. We're going to sell your women and children into slavery. We're going to slaughter your animals. We're going to burn your crops, and we're going to burn your village. So if you choose the red wampum belt of war, go in peace, but get ready because we're coming. And then he says, if you choose the white wampum belt of peace, you can leave here in peace too. You go back to your village and you know that you're going to live in peace because we're going to be your friends forever. So the choice is yours. And it doesn't matter to me which one you choose. And then he walks away. Now, we didn't have this sermon in my time, but in your day, I think you'd call that a mic drop. Now, these Indians are equal parts awed and terrified by Clark. And most of them, right there on the spot, pledged that they are going to put down the tomahawk and not raid Kentucky anymore. Not all of them. In fact, the Shawnee were particularly hostile all the way through the Revolution into the early 19th century. But he was successful in getting most of the Indians to swear not to fight anymore. In fact, some of these Indians wanted to switch sides and fight for us. And Clark wouldn't let them. And it's not because they weren't good warriors. They were excellent warriors. It was just out of sheer morality. Remember, we're supposed to have 350 men. We're 200 men under strength. And we have all these Indians that want to switch sides and fight for us, and Clark won't let them. And he told them, he said, this isn't your war. He said, this doesn't involve you. This is between us and the British, and I don't want it to involve you. He said, all we ask is that you sit out the rest of the war and stop raiding Kentucky. Now, one of these Indians that wanted to switch sides was a chief of the Piankashaw. His name was, in fact, I don't even know his real Indian name. I never heard him called by his real Indian name. He went by Francois, son of tobacco. The French called him Francois. That obviously isn't his Indian name. He was called son of tobacco because his father was chief tobacco, so he's son of tobacco. His title was the Grandeur of the Wabash because his Piankashaw village, it was called Chippewa. It was right here at Vincennes, but he controlled the entire Wabash River Valley. So nothing happened in the Wabash without the Grandeur knowing about it. So keep son of tobacco in the back of your mind because he will reemerge in our story in a very important capacity in just a little bit. So now, we've accomplished almost everything we set out to do in our Illinois campaign. We're in control of Kaskaskia, Cahokia, Vincennes. We've successfully liaisoned with the Spanish in St. Louis and been resupplied, and we've successfully treated with the Indian tribes in the region at Cahokia. And this is where the problem starts. Henry Hamilton, up here in Detroit, the British lieutenant governor of the entire region, learns of our expedition, and he puts together a hasty force to kick us out. So he gets his King's 8th Regiment afoot and several hundred Indian allies, and they launch an expedition down the Maumee River. They portage here, get into the headwaters of the Wabash, and take the Wabash all the way down to Vincennes, and they recapture Vincennes. And poor Leonard Helm was completely unable to defend it. Remember, he's only got himself and one private soldier, the local French militia, and an indefensible, dilapidated fort, so he had no choice but to surrender. So now we have lost Vincennes. It's back in control of the British and Henry Hamilton. But, to our great good fortune, it's December of 1778. And that means the campaign season is over. Nobody campaigned in the winter in my time because it was suicide to do it. More men always died from exposure to the elements and from disease than ever died at the hands of the enemy in my time. And in fact, that was true all the way up to World War I. So nobody campaigned in the winter. Now you hear that and you say, well, what about when George Washington crossed the Delaware? Wasn't that on Christmas night? It was, but that's not a campaign. That was a raid. He never had any intention of taking or holding any ground. He crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night, hit a Hessian encampment at Trenton, and immediately went back across the river. About a week later, he crosses the Delaware again, reoccupies Trenton briefly, fights a very low-level skirmish at a creek, and then moves on and hits Cornwallis's rear guard at Princeton, and then goes back across the river for winter quarters. That's a skirmish and a raid. That's not a campaign. Nobody campaigned in the winter in the 18th century because it was crazy to do it. So now, Hamilton's plan is he sends most of his King's 8th Regiment back up to Detroit for the winter, where they can be adequately sheltered and fed. He sends most of his Indian allies back to their villages for the same reason. Sent some of them back into Kentucky for another raid. But the plan was he was going to keep a small amount of the King's 8th Regiment at Vincennes with him to rebuild the fort over the course of the winter. And then in the spring, everyone was to reconvene there, which would now be rebuilt in a suitable base of operations. And they were going to continue their campaign against us on the Mississippi River and annihilate us. And we found out about that because, again, all these French townspeople talked back and forth to each other. So we found out what his plan for the spring was. And we knew that we couldn't stand against him. We knew the size of the force that he had put together and was going to reconvene in the spring, and we knew that he would wipe us out in the spring. So Clark called the council and the officers together, and we decided that we had three options. We could surrender, and there was no chance we were going to do that. We could flee for safety across the Mississippi River to our Spanish allies, which would have preserved us, but it also would have forfeited all the gains that we had made. Or we could do the crazy and we could attack. What do you think we chose to do? We decided we were going to attack. As Clark pointed out to us in the meeting, he said Hamilton is as weak now as he is ever going to be. And we have to attack now or forever quit the country. So we decided that's what we're going to do. We bought a riverboat at Kaskaskia. We bought the largest riverboat that we could find, and we put every gun that we had on it. And by guns, I'm not talking about small arms like rifles and muskets. I'm talking about swivel guns and small artillery pieces. We put every gun that we had on it. We crewed it with 46 of us Virginians, and we called it the Willing. And the plan was the Willing was supposed to make its way down the Kaskaskia to the Mississippi, down to the Ohio. That's all downstream. Then they were going to pole their way up the Ohio to the Wabash, and then pole their way upstream on the Wabash until they got to Vincennes. They were going to anchor right outside Fort Sackville and use its guns to blow down the wall of the fort. The rest of us, now augmented by the local Cahokia and Kaskaskia French militias, were going to march overland following an old buffalo trace from Kaskaskia to Vincennes. So my company was recalled from Cahokia. We rejoined the rest of the regiment at Kaskaskia, and then we all marched overland to Vincennes. Now, we departed Kaskaskia on February the 5th, 1779. This is 1779 now. We depart then, and it was an unusually warm February that year. And when you hear that, you might say, well, how lucky? Well, it was actually a disaster because those warm air temperatures meant that the entire winter's worth of snow and ice was melting and all the rivers were in full flood. So the air temperature might not have been that cold, but the water was freezing and it was everywhere. Southern Illinois in your time isn't what Southern Illinois was in my time. In your time, it's been the terrain, the topography has been changed by man to allow for modern agriculture, but in my time, it was just a massive floodplain. Remember, you're in between three major river valleys here, the Mississippi / Kaskaskia, the Ohio, and the Wabash, and all the tributary creeks and streams that flow into them. And it was all in full flood. We would have much rather marched over frozen ground than flooded ground. So as it was, we were always up to our knees in freezing water, frequently up to our waists, occasionally up to our shoulders and necks. And we did this day after day after day for 18 days. We covered 240 miles in 18 days. And we would try and march from piece of high ground to piece of high ground and make our evening camps on those areas of high ground, build a fire, and dry out our clothing and our feet, only to plunge back into the freezing water the very next day and do it all over again. Bless you. By the time we got to February 18th, we ran out of food. And we wouldn't get to Vincennes until February 23rd. So on the 18th, we run out of food. And there's nothing to forage because everything's flooded. We tried to hunt for game, but same thing as the forage. It's hard to find game because everything's flooded. We were occasionally able to get small game like rabbits and possums. Once we got one deer. But you can imagine how far a deer goes when you're trying to feed 175 men. So by the time we get to our final water obstacle, the men are not only frozen, but they're also starving. So we have one last river to cross, except the problem is it's not really a river anymore. What it was 4 rivers that had flowed together because they were all in full flood and had jumped their banks. So it's the White River, it's the Embarrass River, the Wabash and the Little Wabash. They had all flowed together and they had formed essentially a large lake. And we needed to get across it. And for the first time ever, and by the way, we had tried to steal some canoes. We were successful in finding and stealing a small number of canoes, and we were also able to make a couple of dugout canoes. But we had nowhere near enough canoes to get all the men across. So for the first time in this entire campaign, the men refused to go. And now later historians have said that the men mutinied. And that's not true. The men did not mutiny. They just couldn't go any further. They had been pushed to their limits. They were freezing. They hadn't had anything to eat in 6 days, and they just couldn't go any further. Or so they thought. Because Colonel Clark, remember in your time, you'd call him a master of psychology. What Clark knew is that your mind always quits before your body does. Your body can do amazing, superhuman things when your mind is committed to it. And what he needed to do is recommit everybody's minds. So the plan he came up with is we had a very tall sergeant in one of the companies. He was 6'2", and he was a huge, powerful man. And unlike many of the men, he was still in very good physical condition at this time. And we also had a little drummer boy. Believe it or not, we had a drummer boy with us. And this poor drummer boy, when we're marching in flood water that's up to our thighs, it's up to his chest. So the way he used to get across these rivers is he would float across on his drum. He would get on his drum and he would paddle and kick his way across the river, and it made the men laugh every time they saw it. So this sergeant was very loyal to Clark, and Clark went to him and said, I need you to lead us into the water. He said, I'm going to put the drummer boy on your shoulder, and I'm going to have him beat charge, and I need you to lead us into the water. And then he called the rest of us officers together, and he simply told us, do what I do. So Clark goes down to the edge of the water, and he kneels down, and he pours water from his powder horn into his hand. In gunpowder, if you don't know, when it gets wet, it makes a very thick black paste. So he scoops up some water from the river, and he mixes it with the gunpowder, and he makes this paste, and then he sets his face like flint. And he smears this powder across his face, and he's now black as the devil. And he comes up and he draws his sword from his scabbard, and he points to the drummer boy and tells him to beat charge. And he thrusts his sword forward and lets out a war whoop, and he plunges himself into the water, pushing the ice floes out of the way in front of him. And now every single man who 10 minutes prior couldn't go one more step, one by one, they all pick themselves up off the ground, and they get their rifles and their powder horns, and they put them up above their head so they stay dry, and they all plunge into the water after Clark. And that's how we got across that last water obstacle. So now, there is nothing between us and Fort Sackville anymore. There is nothing between us and a fire. There's nothing between us and food. There's nothing between us and a roof over our head outside of Henry Hamilton and the British who are in Fort Sackville. And you think that's going to stop us after what we've been through? They didn't stand a chance. Now, Clark engages in a little bit of deception. Remember I said we had been authorized 7 companies of 50 men? Well, we had flags made for each one of those companies, and we'd never used them up till this time. And in addition, the local French militias had their own standards that they brought with them. So once we got across the river, there was an area of high ground that was in clear view of the fort. And then it dipped down into low ground that couldn't be seen from the fort. So what Clark did is we cut down and made some very long flag poles, and we took our flags and we put them on these poles, and we intentionally marched to the top of the hill and held those flags up as high as we could so that they could deliberately be seen. And we marched over the hill down into the low ground, and then when we got into the low ground, we furled those flags up, went back around the base of the hill, put a new flag on, stuck it up, and did the exact same thing again until we had used all of our flags, trying to create the illusion that we were far stronger than we were. Now, the day that happened, this is now February 23rd, what do you think also happened that day?
Snow.
Pardon?
No.
No, not snow. Henry Hamilton and the King's 8th Regiment had finished rebuilding Fort Sackville, and because nobody attacks in the winter, he gave everybody the day off, so there was nobody watching. The French townspeople saw it in the village, and they told us later it was very impressive. But nobody in Fort Sackville saw this subterfuge with the flag, so it went for naught. Anyways, Clark sent a letter to the townspeople ahead of us saying, by this evening, I'm going to be in control of your town. If any of you have changed sides and want to fight with the British, go into the fort and get ready. Anyone that still is on our side, stay in your homes. Any man that we find under arms in the street, we're going to consider to be an enemy, and they'll be shot on the spot. So we get to Fort Sackville late in the evening. We surround it on the evening of the 23rd, and we open fire on it. And now the French townspeople are kind enough to start bringing us out food and resupplying us with powder. So we're firing on the fort. You all have the parade uniforms?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how close you are to finishing.
I'm not that far away, 5 minutes. So now we start pouring a very heavy fire into the fort. And the British start taking casualties because they have no idea we're there. And Hamilton happens to be in Helm's quarters. Remember, Helm was the captain who left there. He's in Helm's quarters playing cards with him. He actually treated Helm very well. And they're not shocked when they hear the gunfire, because between the French village and the Indian village and the fort, it wasn't uncommon to hear gunfire at night. So they just figure it's regular evening guns being fired. But when the British regulars start being hit and they take casualties, that's when they know they're under attack. So one of their men then bursts through the door of Helm's quarters and he informs Hamilton, "Sir, we're under attack." And Helm knew exactly what it was. Helm pushed himself away from the table. He was telling me this story later. He pushed himself away from the table, threw his cards down, and he pointed at Hamilton and he said, "It's Clark. And by the end of this night, you're going to be his prisoner." So now the British aren't exposing themselves anymore, because as Clark mentioned, every time they opened up a cannon port, a dozen musket balls fly through it. So they're just not exposing themselves anymore. So we're just firing indiscriminately because we need to keep up a heavy fire so that they think there's a lot of us. And in the morning, Clark sends word to Hamilton inside the fort demanding its surrender, and Hamilton refuses. He says, as a British officer, I'll do no such dishonorable thing or something like that. And so we continue to fire on the fort. And then guess what comes? And we're trying to figure out how we're going to get in the fort, by the way. Willing hasn't shown up. So we're talking about a plan to undermine the fort, to tunnel underneath one of the walls, pack it with gunpowder, detonate it, blow one of the walls down. And then what comes crashing out of the woods is an Indian raiding party from Kentucky, fresh from the kill with the bloody scalp still hanging from their belt. And we knew they were coming because remember the grand door of the Wabash? Well, his village was right there at Vincennes, Chippewa Cay. And nothing happens in the Wabash without the grand door knowing about it. Well, he knew this war party was coming in and he alerted us to it. And he told us that the protocol was that when they came out of the woods, they would fire their guns in the air and let out their war whoops to announce to the fort that they were coming in, and a party from the fort would come out to meet them and do the same. Now, these Indians didn't know we were there. So Clark detached a party of us to go out to pretend we were the party from the fort and to go out and meet them. But he said, "Don't any of you fire your guns until you've made sure that all of them have, and then kill all of them." So the Indians come out of their woods with their bloody scalps hanging from their belts, and they're yelling their war whoops and firing their guns in the air, and our men come out to meet them, and we're yelling and whooping and holding our guns in the air, except none of us are shooting, until we saw that every last one of them had fired, and then we lower our rifles and we fire into all of them. There was a party of about 20 of them. We killed 2 of them on the spot. We captured 6 of them, including their chief. The rest of them scattered into the woods, and we wouldn't find this out until later, but only one of them ever made it back to his village. The rest of them went into the woods and died of their wounds. And of these 6 that we captured, we found out that 2 of them were captured Kentuckians. It was hard to tell from a distance because, again, on the frontier, everybody looks like this. We found out 2 of them were Kentuckians, so we freed them. And of the remaining 4, Clark now knows how he's going to get into this fort. So he parades these Indians on the main street in front of the fort, close enough where it could easily be seen from the walls of the fort, but far enough away where we couldn't be engaged with musket fire. And he makes these Indians kneel down for their execution. And they know what's coming, so they get down on their knees and they start singing their death chants. And then the executioner gets behind them, and one by one, he goes down the line and he just tomahawks them all in the back of the head and kills them. And then we put ropes around their necks and we dragged the dead bodies to the Wabash River and threw them in the river and watched them float away. And Hamilton is watching this, and Hamilton is now terrified. And Hamilton now sends word to Clark that he wants to discuss terms of surrender. And if Clark doesn't want to meet him in the fort, he'll meet him in neutral ground in the church in town. So that's where they meet. Hamilton brings his party, Clark brings his party, and they negotiate the surrender of the fort. And Clark had told Hamilton, by the way, he said, "If you force me to storm your fort, you and your men can expect no better treatment than you saw those Indians receive earlier." And Hamilton is absolutely terrified, so he agrees to surrender. So the appointed time is set for the next day at 10 o'clock in the morning. So the way that you would surrender back then is the surrendering officer would come out, meet the conquering officer, draw his sword, and present it to the conquering officer. The conquering officer would take the sword ceremonially and then immediately return it to him and say something like, "Never from so fine a hand," or some term of respect like that. So at 10 o'clock, we're lining the fort. The main gate flies open. Hamilton walks out ahead of the King's 8th Regiment. And he walks up to Clark, and this is the first time he's seen how few men we have. And he's scared. He doesn't know if he's leading himself into an ambush. He doesn't know what's about to happen. So he's very nervous. And he approaches Clark, and he draws his sword, and he presents it to him, and he says, "Sir, where are your men?" And Clark looks at him and he smiles, and he says, "Sir, my men stand before you." And with that, Hamilton knew he had been duped. But we were already in the fort, and the deal had been made. He couldn't go back on it. So we have now recaptured Fort Sackville and Henry, the hair buyer Hamilton. So now we are in control of Cahokia, Kaskaskia, Vincennes. We never had the manpower to get to Detroit, but we really didn't need to because Detroit came to us in the form of Henry Hamilton. We've made liaison with our Spanish allies in St. Louis. We successfully treated with most of the Indians in the area to get them to stop raiding Kentucky, and that is essentially how the war ends on the frontier. It would continue on for years after that, but on the frontier, that's how it ends. So we enter the Treaty of Paris negotiations in 1783 with us in control of those three outposts, and on the basis of that and that alone, our negotiators claimed the entire Northwest Territory for America. So remember, all of modern-day Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, including the Upper Peninsula, Wisconsin, and a portion of northeastern Minnesota, we claim all of it because 150 Virginians are in control of these three tiny little outposts down here in the extreme southwestern portion of it, and the British give it to us. And that is the only reason why any of the states that came out of that territory are part of America today. Because if we had never undertaken our campaign, or if it had been unsuccessful, all of that territory remains part of British North America, which means today it's all Canada. So 3 weeks from yesterday, you're going to be celebrating the 250th birthday of our country. And you're going to be enjoying it by drinking lemonade and eating hot dogs and watching fireworks. And keep in mind, the only reason you're doing that is because of the Illinois Regiment in the conquest of the Northwest Territory. And imagine what a sad, pitiful existence you'd be having if you were Canadian on the 4th of July. I don't know what you'd do. You'd probably be putting gravy on French fries and pouring maple syrup all over everything. So as you enjoy your 4th of July, remember, the only reason you're doing it is because of this campaign. The revolution didn't just happen on the eastern seaboard. It happened right here in Illinois, and that's why we're American.